listed in 3 different places. So I want to get a sense of who's from where. So if I'm going to call out the major student groups, and if you belong to them, just raise your hand so I can see sort of what roughly the balance is. How many people here are planning to take this course from the Kennedy School? Okay. How many planning to take this course from the law school? Okay. How many college students, undergraduates? Okay, good. I know there are some graduate students from other schools and departments, so if you're actually registered from other graduate students or departments at Harvard, okay. Cross-listed students? Okay. Auditors? Okay, all right. Okay, that's helpful for me. I guess the other thing I should add is that there are, for different groups of registered students, there are different writing requirements. So make sure that you know which group you belong in. And especially for Kennedy School students, there is a weekly writing assignment. The topic of the assignment, the prompt, should be out on Canvas sometime today. So you'll have a week to write it. So the first one will be due on Monday. So typically they're due early in the morning on Monday, on every Monday. Okay, so look out for them. Finally, unhappy topic, use of ChatGPT AI. This is a major issue. For the purposes of this course, you're not allowed to use any AI, generative AI, ChatGPT, and similar things. Okay, so that's a strict rule for this course, for the purpose of preparing assignments for this course, I should say. Anything else on?
Well, there's one practical issue. When you speak from your desk, turn on your microphones. There's a microphone in front of each place, and it works by touch, so you have to keep pressing it while you're speaking for it to magnify your voice.
Okay. Are there any sort of administrative or logistical questions that anybody wants to ask before we get into the substance? Can you hear my voice from the back? Does it carry? No. It does. I don't know if there's a volume control here. I think there's a volume here. No? Maybe where did I see it? Microphone volume. Okay. I'm turned it all the way up, so maybe this is great. Thank you. When you start speaking, I'll lower it. I'll make it half, and then when I need to speak over you, I'm going to. Okay, very good. So as I said, this is going to be an interactive course. So typically, one of us will start, the other will respond, and so forth. For our opening session, we've agreed that I would lead off for a 20-minute or so introduction. Then I'll turn to Roberto and get his perspective on these issues. We'll discuss and then we'll go from there. Okay? All right. So let me start with some of the key themes of this course as I see them. Why do we need a different political economy for the future? I'd like to think about this issue along 3 different dimensions, 3 different challenges that I think our economies face. The 3 are, first, the climate change and sustainability. Second, the restoration of the middle class. And third, the stimulation of, or the process of poverty reduction and economic growth in the rest of the world. So let me say a little bit about each one of these 3 and why they create challenges and why these challenges are challenges of political economy. On the climate change front, with all the extreme weather events that we've been having, the fires in California and so forth, I think it's not necessary for me to emphasize what a real issue this is. We're teetering on the edge of the 1.5 degrees Celsius heating up, warming of our climate, after which there is serious possibilities of various irreversible nonlinearities that would kick in with very significant negative consequences. These extreme weather events, the loss of biodiversity and loss in agricultural productivity, the flooding, the stress that our urban areas confront, these are effects that are felt very unevenly around the world. Some parts of the world will face it to a much greater extent. And one of the tragedies of climate change, of course, is that some of the lower income, the poorer parts of the world are the ones that are going to be facing a much greater negative consequences. In part, this is a technical issue, but in larger part, it's a political economy issue. The technical issues are really about figuring out what the climate dynamics are, mapping the relationship between emissions and temperatures, and from temperatures to consequences. But what really has prevented us from taking action on this front is the political economy. And political economy of climate change, or addressing climate change in a very simple way, is simply the tension between winners and losers. And this tension between winners and losers is both in terms of different groups, different economic players, different regions, but also, of course, generationally, different generations. We pay the cost of mitigating and adapting today. The beneficiaries are going to be largely future generations. Coal mining communities or companies that derive their incomes from fossil fuels, as well as workers and groups of people who derive their incomes from fossil fuels, are immediately going to be losers, while those that benefit from green tech and renewables will be winners. So what has stymied to a large extent an acceptable climate transition is a way that politically being unable to work out what needs to be done and to implement it in ways that can bring a large group of people together. So the political economy question on the climate transition is what kind of a productive transformation strategy can we pursue that's going to bring along a large number of these groups in a favorable kind of a dynamic rather than resistant. The second challenge I said was restoring the middle class. This is largely, although not exclusively, an advanced country issue, although many middle-income countries, such as yours, Roberto, Brazil, and mine, Turkey, also face similar kind of challenges. Why do I focus on the middle class? Because, as I think we will discuss later in the course, I think the erosion of the middle class, which has been most significant in the United States, but also has been felt in Europe, in other middle-income countries, I believe is at the root of the rise of right-wing authoritarian populism. It's a very old idea that goes back to Aristotle, that it's very difficult to have democratic societies or political democracy in settings where there are very large divisions in society between sort of winners and losers, or people who are at the bottom and people who are at the top. Without large, healthy, self-confident middle classes, it's very difficult to have healthy politics, healthy liberal democracies. And I think the erosion of labor market security, the increase in economic anxiety among the middle classes has been a very significant factor driving support for far-right authoritarian political groups. So the question is, how do we reverse that? What is the nature of the productive transformation that is going to address the needs and anxieties of the middle class so that we can not only produce more equitable societies, but actually as a result also can build better politics on top of that. Third challenge I said was poverty reduction, and therefore the need to produce economic growth, because economic growth is the most significant lever for achieving poverty reduction, as the experience of China and other East Asian countries has shown. How do we achieve that in low and middle income countries as well as the advanced countries? Now, this is one area where until the pandemic, we had a lot of good news. If you look at the record of poverty reduction up until COVID, we had more than 500 million people lifted from extreme poverty, largely through the effects of very rapid economic growth in China. But this poverty, this very positive record on poverty reduction was not limited to China. It was elsewhere in East Asia, in South Asia, parts of Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa as well. But now we are running into different sets of challenges where it is legitimate to question whether that poverty reduction record can continue because there are a number of changes in the technological and political context and the geopolitical context in the world that makes that process of economic growth and poverty reduction much harder going forward. The most important of those, as we will discuss here in the course at length, is the running out of steam of the export-oriented industrialization model. That's how China grew rich, that's how South Korea and Taiwan grew rich, that's how Japan grew rich, that's how Germany grew rich, that's how largely the United States grew rich, and then you can run it all the way back to the Industrial Revolution. That's how manufacturing and the path of industrialization was the key vehicle through which rapid economic growth was achieved. For a variety of reasons, but most significantly the nature of technological change in manufacturing, which has made it much more labor and skill intensive and much less capable of absorbing a lot of labor in low middle income countries. Export-oriented industrialization, or industrialization more broadly, is no longer serving that role of being a vehicle for rapid economic growth. Now, what's common across all these three challenges, climate change, restoring the middle class, and stimulating poverty reduction and economic growth, is that dealing successfully with all these three challenges requires fundamental structural change, changes in our structure of production. That means augmenting the capabilities of certain activities, certain sectors in the economy, empowering individuals, families, workers to take part in those newer economic activities, thereby serving the goals of climate change, sustainability, expanding ranks of the middle class, as well as promoting economic growth. So there is a common cross-cutting theme of how do we stimulate the right kind of structural change, whether it is to foster green industries, whether it is to produce more secure, more productive jobs for the middle class, or to generate new economic activities that will draw people out of informality or low productive agriculture, traditional agriculture in the developing countries. So appropriate structural change in the productive sphere is the key prerequisite for achieving all three of these transformations. And then the political economy that we're looking for is precisely what are the economic political conditions and approaches and orientations that will get us there, that will achieve that kind of structural transformation. Now, a key theme that will run through this course, because this is where Roberto and I agree completely, that this process of structural transformation in the productive sphere is not one that can be left to the markets alone. So we will, I think, pay sufficient respect to the power of markets and private initiative in terms of being extremely important to have fostered many of the productive technological and industrialization dynamics and miracles of our to date. So we are not downplaying the role of markets, private incentives, or private capital. And we are certainly not downplaying Adam Smith's key insight that decentralized initiative and enterprise is a fundamental engine for economic growth and productive transformation. Yet, I think we both believe that markets alone, or private initiative on its own, is inadequate to engineer these kinds of productive structural transformations. So in the language of economists, there are a whole series of market failures although the right way to think about it is really much broader than just simply the technical category of market failure. What are those market failures that require public or collective action? Of course, the most obvious is externalities. That's where it shows up in the case of climate change. Emitting carbon is probably the archetypal example of an externality. If you're a steel plant here that's emitting carbon into the atmosphere, it changes, it accumulates to carbon for the world as a whole and changes climate on some other part of the world. There are other market failures. There are coordination failures, that a lot of investments in new technologies, in new activities require coordination on the part of different types of actors, whether it's investment in specific kinds of skills, whether it's investment in particular upstream infrastructure, whether it's investment in legal or technical standards to ensure that certain industries can take off. These coordination problems cannot necessarily be solved in a purely decentralized way, and that may require government or collective action. Scale economies is a third category that create complications. When you have technologies that have very strong scale and network effects, such as AI today, of course, is a critical illustration of that. There is the problem that power can be concentrated very quickly in a few hands. And therefore, you have the possibility of both needing to start investments that have strong scale economies that the private sector alone may not achieve on its own, but that once these sectors get going, certain firms take on critical advantage early on, that it might be very difficult to achieve subsequent entry and dynamism, because these monopolists will want to prevent entry and capture the markets for themselves. So market power becomes a critical, or concentrated or excessive market power becomes a critical problem that not only blocks subsequent economic dynamism, structural change through insider power, but also, of course, can subsequently exert significant corrosive effects on our politics as well. So for all these reasons, public action becomes key. Then our focus really sort of then turns to the question of what kind of public action, what kind of collective action, what does that mean, how do we think about that? Economists have a standard way of thinking about how to solve these market failure problems, and I will refer to it as a kind of a traditional first best kind of an approach, which is identify the market failure, then target the right remedy to it. So if it's an externality, let's say a climate change externality, let's then subsidize or let's tax firms that produce, that emit. So that would be sort of the most directly targeted remedy, would be a kind of a tax that forces firms to internalize the cost of the negative externalities they generate for the rest of society. If there are innovation externalities, learning by doing externalities, simply subsidize, apply the appropriate Pigovian subsidy so that firms can internalize the benefits that they produce for the rest of society. So if it's negative externalities, positive externalities, in this first best approach, there is always an appropriate tax or subsidy that would actually induce firms, investors, technologies to internalize those external effects. Now, in a lot of areas that we're going to be talking about, the nature of these market externalities are diffuse, unknown, dynamic, and therefore governments don't actually have all the finely detailed information to react to these in a very appropriate manner. So here, I think Roberto and I will be talking, and I'm putting words in his mouth, but we'll be, I think, presenting different variations, or let's say, we'll be, presenting, different types of what Chuck Sable and Roberto and other work have called experimentalist governance. which is sort of a way of approaching how we deal with these collective action problems in a very different way. I will call it the second best approach rather than a first best approach. So this is a process where public institutions, governments, collective actors engage in a process of discovery to figure out where the problems are and what types of remedies work best. This process of discovery doesn't presume knowing the problems ex ante, doesn't presume knowing the solutions and remedies ex ante, but it's a process of discovery. It's also a process that's significantly more messy than the first best textbook approach. But it's also one that's conducive to building coalitions, strengthening civic power, and learning more dynamically as these relationships take place. I know this sounds quite abstract, but I hope we will get into sort of what this might mean in different spheres and different ways that we approach our three challenges that I mentioned at the outset. So at this point, I'm just trying to signal a general orientation. Why are these new challenges, and what is different today? Let me mention some key points that are, again, sort of critical backgrounds to our discussion here. One premise, and I think this is a point of agreement between Roberto and I, is that our traditional Keynesian social democratic approach to creating shared prosperity is no longer adequate. So the approaches that we will have to contemplate have to go beyond the sort of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s kind of Belle Epoque approach. For one, of course, that consensus, that if you think about the Keynesian social democratic consensus, that was a kind of a cross-sector coalition between big business and big labor, completely, of course, disregarded climate change. So one of our critical challenges was not even on the agenda of that consensus. But there are sort of deeper changes as well, which is that social democratic Keynesian consensus was built on the premises of a largely industrial society, where the middle class rested on the back of a kind of an industrial workforce that was largely unionized, or at least represented by trade unions. Whereas this no longer represents today's working class. The manufacturing industrial working class in the advanced countries has been shrinking pretty much everywhere, even in the most successful countries in terms of manufacturing in the world, such as Germany or Japan. It's been shrinking in China. So we need to think about the working class very differently and the kind of cross-sectoral coalitions and the type of political economy that is inclusive that we need to generate in ways that are very different than what that Keynesian social democratic consensus presented. What took the place of the Keynesian social democratic consensus is a set of policies that have come to be called variably neoliberalism or hyper-globalization or market fundamentalism. And we know, of course, what the shortcomings of that period was as well. We're clearly sort of moving out of that because that neoliberalism and hyper-globalization not only did not significantly take on the climate challenge, but it also created very significant economic, social, cultural, political divisions within countries, of which I think the rise of the far right and authoritarian populism is the most significant consequence. And paradoxically, neoliberalism and hyperglobalization had the consequences that as economies, or at least their most internationally competitive segments, integrated with each other, within themselves, economies disintegrated. So there was this joint process of economic integration globally going along with economic, social, and cultural and political disintegration within countries. And that process of disintegration is, I think, what has poisoned significantly our politics. And therefore, the rise of authoritarian populism. as we will discuss here, I think the solutions, the remedies that authoritarian populism has to offer are largely inadequate. They are distractions rather than true remedies, and we hope we will discuss that today and the rest of the term. We have seen, I think, glimmers of a kind of a radical departure from neoliberalism under President Biden's industrial policies, but in some sense, those also, have, at least in the short term, obviously have not delivered politically, and I think there are other reasons why, in fact, those policies may not have adequately targeted the three challenges, because even though they claim they took on the climate challenge and the middle class challenge frontally, those policies were largely ignored the needs of the rest of the world, developing countries in particular. And secondly, the main mechanisms that Biden's industrial policies use to restore the middle class, to bring the health of the middle class, was going back to sort of, in some sense, fetishizing manufacturing and trying to bring manufacturing back, which I believe is largely a dead end, given that the bulk of workers are and will remain in the future in services. So I think in some sense did not deal appropriately with the changed nature of the working class either. So our key questions then, and with this I will end and turn to Roberto. What kind of an overall policy orientation do we have to take on to deal with these challenges under these different circumstances, thereby creating inclusive, sustainable economies that will also be politically viable. So that's my introduction to the issues as I see them, as the challenges that confront us. I'll turn to you, Roberto, and so I'll ask one small question and a bigger question, but of course you can take it in any direction you want. Smaller question is, do you agree with my framing of the challenges and what we want to discuss? And then sort of the bigger question is, sort of how do you see the relationship between the rise of authoritarian populism and the need to address a kind of, or generate a new kind of political economy?
I think a good place to start is with the question of what most people in the world want, in order to understand how it is that there might emerge in the world new growth miracles, new radical expansions of economic growth that could then be made socially inclusive. So most people in the world are not workers, industrial workers, the favored constituency of the left in the past. Most people in the world are what in the old vocabulary of European social thought we could call petty bourgeois. They're not in big organizations, they don't work for big companies, and what they want is to own a small store in the city, a farm, to master a trade for which they can charge. But they remain poor. They are poor and disorganized, but their horizon of aspiration, rather than being proletarian, is petty bourgeois. And thus we could call them a subjective petty bourgeoisie. They're not objectively petty bourgeois, but their imagination, their aspiration is petty bourgeois. Now, what they want will not produce a growth miracle. If they were to have it in the way in which they want it, it won't produce a growth miracle because traditional, isolated family business, the object of their aspiration, is not a path to rapid economic growth. Based on self-exploitation and family saving. So for there to be a growth miracle, in the class societies of the contemporary world, there has to be a division in the asset holding classes, in the elites. In many of the countries around the world, the dominant element is financial. The elites are money-driven or oriented to finance, and finance is in command. For there to be a growth miracle, there has to be a division within the elites, within the asset-holding classes. And there has to emerge in the elites a counter-elite with a productivist orientation that opposes the financial rentiers who ordinarily command the national economy. And this counter-elite has to seek power. In order to win power, it has to win the allegiance of a large part of the people, of the masses, who are in large part this subjective petty bourgeoisie that I described, and offer them an alternative to the way in which they direct their aspirations. So not just traditional family business, but something else. And that then becomes a discussion about the alternative form of the market economy, which is one of our main themes in the course. So that seems to me to be a way of anchoring our concern, the concerns that you've approached through your initial discussion, in the realities of the contemporary societies. And it then leads to the next set of questions, which are, what are these alternatives? And what are the different ways of conceiving a market economy? The last major institutional and ideological refoundation in the world was the social democratic or social liberal or Keynesian settlement of the mid-20th century. And the premise of that settlement was, we can't replace the market. What we can do is to humanize the market through compensatory redistribution by redistributive social spending and redistributive taxation. We can regulate economic activity and we can redistribute after the fact. But in fact, there's a third thing that we can do with a market, which is we can reinvent it. We can redesign its institutional and legal arrangements, including the basic way in which it designs economic decentralization. And that then is the point at which the real discussion of these agents from below turns into the search for alternatives in the world. That's how I would begin.
So, first, let me restate what I heard you to say as the kind of what the agent of change or how change happens. Because you said that it happens.
So the premise is that the agent of change has to be a de facto partnership between what I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie and the productivist counter-elite. They, in partnership, have to be the agents of this revolution.
So that seems to me it's a story about how the right political coalition can be formed to get change. So you made a distinction between the productivist elite and the rentier elite.
Yeah.
So can you say a little bit more about that? Sort of in today's world, who are the rentier elites? Who are the productivist elites?
Well, they're the financiers, and they're the ones who benefit from a situation in which finance, rather than serving the real economy, serves itself and uses the transactions of the real economy as the opportunity for gain.
So let's bracket the discussion on finance, because we do
We'll
have
come to
one
that.
session
Absolutely.
on finance where we will be talking about. And the productivist elite, so would be like would the tech firms in the US be part of the productivist elite today?
They could be, of course, but there is then a problem with respect to the way in which technologically advanced production has developed in the world. So there is a vanguard, which we can call the knowledge economy, another major subject of our discussion in the course. But the knowledge economy that has emerged in the world is an insular knowledge economy. It is a knowledge economy for the few rather than a knowledge economy for the many. And it is an example of a characteristic way in which innovation happens in the world. Innovation is cut down to size. It takes place truncated or downsized to accommodate the dominant interests and the established preconceptions. So this insular knowledge economy for the many is an island or an archipelago of islands that excludes the vast majority of people, including those whom I call the subjective petty bourgeoisie. So a simplified account of the situation is that the vanguard of production is now this highly advanced technological form of production, and everyone else in the societies is basically condemned to some form of make work. That's the limit of this description.
So how does the increase, how does the rise of the far right populism and increasing political support for such movements, how is that
Connected.
How is that connected with this particular framework where you have essentially the distinction between rentier and productivist elites, and then large mass of small property owners or shopkeepers or middle small businesses?
So the industrial workers, the industrial labor force, the constituency of the progressive forces in the previous historical period, in the earlier century, are not now seen, as Marx saw them, as a representative of the universal interests of humanity. They're seen increasingly as just one more interest group, seen by society, and ultimately they come to see themselves in that way. They don't represent the interests of the whole. So the interests of the whole have to be recreated by some new arrangement. And that then passes through a series of dilemmas that are the main object of our discussion in the course. So the first regards the knowledge economy itself and the contrast between an insular, socially exclusive knowledge economy and a knowledge economy for the many, for the majority. The second question regards the status of labor. The premise was that labor must be free. So there can't be rapid and inclusive economic growth on the basis of slave labor. And the major device for the emancipation or freedom of labor under the previous dispensation was countervailing power, it's unionization. Now labor is not unionized. Unionization in many of the countries in the contemporary world is a residue which survives mainly in public employment and in the third sector. There's no major unionization in the private economy. An increasing part of the labor force, both in rich and developing economies, is relegated to precarious labor, unstable labor, without the protections of the law. And technology adds then the third element to this subversion of the freedom of labor, the freedom of free labor, when it is used or developed in a way which simply replaces labor rather than equipping and empowering labor. So for example, we were talking just before class about artificial intelligence. And the premise of the dominant artificial intelligence discussion in the world, which is that the object is to produce something that can be a proxy for the human mind, when in fact it should be a complement to the human mind, and the object should not be the replacement of the mind or of labor, but the equipment of the mind. And so rather than being like the mind, it should be something very different from the mind. So that's the labor angle. And then there's the third angle, which is finance itself. And so finance, rather than serving the real economy, becomes a parasite on the real economy. It sucks out the blood of the real economy. And there are many enigmas under the present arrangement. So what's the purpose of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? Theoretically, it is to finance the productive agenda of society. In fact, the production system is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. And the financial activity that in principle would be the most important, which is the funding of the creation of new assets in new ways, the object of venture capital and its analogs, in fact, occupies a minuscule part of financial activities, even in the economies in which this kind of finance is most developed, like the American. So all of these distortions, but those distortions in turn lead us to a more abstract problem, which is, how do we conceive of the market? Is the market one thing, or can there be radically different forms of market? This is the premise that was underlying much of your argument at the beginning of the course. The dominant assumption has been that there is only one kind of market. There is a literature on varieties of capitalism, so-called, but it doesn't really propose the thesis that markets could be radically reorganized. It just imagines that there are certain variations of the dominant form of market organization. There's the Anglo-Saxon form of the market. There's the Rhineland form, for example, in France or Germany.
Yeah, I want to come back to this idea of reinventing the market economy, because in many ways, as you say, is central to our discussion. And I'll ask you to, give us a couple of examples of what you have in mind,
Absolutely.
so that that we can start with something more concrete as well. But let me first get back to, I think the theory of political change that you presented, and I'll put my own version of it. I think you made a distinction between you laid out a story where political change happens in a kind of an elite-driven way, that you have to rely on the leadership of this productivist segment of the elite, and that then reaches out to this mass of disorganized people who don't necessarily even know where their long-term interests lie, and so forth. And that I didn't like that story too much, honestly. But I did like the distinction that you made, and so between groups in society that are fundamentally, that we can classify them as rentier, versus groups in society that we can fundamentally classify as productivist. And if you know, rentiers, you know, are those who generate their earnings and base their livelihoods on an existing stock of assets without trying to necessarily grow them. So they're interested in keeping their privileges. They're interested in keeping newcomers out. They're incumbents. They are not interested in entry, whereas the productivist one are interested in this process of dynamic renewing and increase in productive innovation and movement into new economic activities, including green areas, as in the case of environmental transformation. Now, what I would say is that this distinction, I think, exists both at the elite level, but also at the level of masses. You know, many small business owners are as much involved, are interested, of course, in maintaining their own privileges and keeping the outsiders out, and those could be immigrants, those could be other small businesses and so forth. So, so with that proviso, I'm happy to buy sort of this distinction between these two groups, and then the question becomes, is the fact that, so we want the productivist groups to have the upper hand so that we can move in the right direction. Does this not happen because fundamentally the productive group, for whatever reason, aren't powerful enough? Or does it happen because they don't have the right ideas? They don't have the right frameworks?
They don't have the project.
They don't have the project.
A programmatic project made
Okay.
of ideas.
So I thought that's what
and
I
a
thought.
political project seeking power.
So that's, and we will focus here mostly on the first of those rather than the political project.
Yes.
I think it's fair to say. But so I think that's where, you know, your idea of reinventing the market comes in, because that's that's a key to that project, correct? That for the productivists.
So maybe I should just say a few words about this idea of reinventing the market,
Yes.
because it's not intuitive.
Okay, but before you do that, I just want to make sure that we're bringing everybody along, and so we're not losing people on terminology or things. So if there are, you know, clarifying questions you want to ask at this point, and sort of where this is going, you know, feel free, or any comments anybody wants to make. Somebody, did I see a hand? Yes. Yeah, please, turn on the microphone if you can.
Does this work? Or
Yeah, I'm not sure, but
You have to keep pressing it.
Got it. The question I had was regarding a point you made, Professor Unger, about the knowledge economy. You noted that we live in a knowledge economy for the few, not the many. And I was hoping you could clarify what that meant, just because my first impression was that given technology, we currently live in a society where knowledge is available for the many, at its most in history.
Well, it's not just because they're users. To some extent, the technological vanguard has to teach people to use what they produce in order to sell it to them. But it's not the mere use of the technologies that then incorporates people into the knowledge economy. So, and this has many dimensions, starting with the most primitive, geographic. Why is there no knowledge economy in North Dakota? The knowledge economy is geographically limited. Then in the evolution of the knowledge economy, the elite that controls the knowledge economy discovered a way to bifurcate production into two parts. The routinized, commodified form, they then subcontract to workers in firms in remote parts of the world where there's a lower tax take and a lighter regulatory burden. And the fun part and the lucrative part they keep for themselves. So the knowledge economy, in fact, as a practice of production, rather than being disseminated, does the opposite. It retreats. It becomes hyper-insular. And it is the multiplication of these forms of retreat which then represents the phenomenon of the insular knowledge economy.
If I can build on, I think that's a great question, and I think part of our orientation is that we want to think of individuals and as being contributors, as being in a position to contribute to that economy in their role as producers. rather than simply as consumers. And I think the sense in which the knowledge economy is disseminated is, yes, we all have cell phones and we can all access ChatGPT, but how many of us have the capacity to actually write the code or to produce the more sophisticated components? Because ultimately, that's the kind of capacity that we're interested in disseminating through our society. So an interesting, if you will, a kind of a 20th century analog of that in some ways, because it relates to a different part of the economy, is the discussions relating to Walmart. So there's been a long-standing debate about how do you think about Walmart. If you think about it as each of us as purely as consumers, Walmart is a godsend because it makes available all these cheap goods to everybody. And I think for a long time, the perspective of many economists, including progressive economists, was to say, look, you shouldn't worry about Walmart bringing all these cheap Chinese goods in, coming in and driving up smaller retailers out from communities and so forth, because it's making all of us better off by providing all these cheaper goods to all of us. Now there's been a kind of there's an ongoing reevaluation of the role of Walmart, in which even economists are now participating, which is to say, well, look at those communities where Walmart actually went in. It turns out that Walmart killed a lot of the ecosystem of the community in terms of productive capabilities, both because suppliers got killed as you got more imports from cheaper sources, as well as from the fact that in order to provide those cheap goods and services, Walmart drove the level of wages down, and therefore not only reducing earnings and wages, but also driving a lot of people from out of the labor market.
But it's tangential to the discussion of the knowledge economy.
Walmart,
I would argue, is not part of the knowledge economy.
No, that's exactly what I'm saying. That's an analogy to, it's the same idea about how we want to think about people as part of the productive ecosphere and want to get them to engage in the productive and technological sphere in their role as producers, not just simply as consumers, is the point that's where I think there's an analogy with Walmart.
So the main activity in political terms was to tame the market by regulating it and to humanize it through redistributive social spending and redistributive taxation. But there's a third thing you can do with the market, which is to reinvent it, to redesign its institutions. And it's the content of that which is then the subject of this moment in our debate, and that we're going to come to in much of the course.
Okay.
And so you can think the market is one thing. I think most of the practical economists still think a market is a market. Property is property. Contract is contract. Actually, the main analytical achievement of legal thought from the middle of the 19th century to the end of the 20th century was to demolish that idea and make it clear that the market has no singular natural form, institutional and legal form. And the people who established that idea were practical Americans like Oliver Wendell Holmes. So the old idea was you can infer from the abstract conceptions of property and contract a series of more concrete propositions. And by successive and cumulative inference, you can go down the ladder until you've laid out the whole package. That was the thesis of the market, that there's one thing called the market. The extreme of that thesis was what we sometimes call market fundamentalism, as in Hayek's idea. So if Robinson Crusoe trades long enough on his island, he will eventually reproduce the whole system of German private law, because implicit in the logic of free exchange and free coordination is a system. The system will be made patent. That's the extreme form. And the forms that prevail are not this extreme form. They're diluted versions of that idea Now, how do we then establish the notion that this idea is false? Well, we can do it in two ways. We can do it in one way from the top down, and that's actually the anomalous way, and we can do it in another way from the bottom up. Now, let me take a moment to describe the top-down procedure because it illuminates the theme. What is a market, basically? It's a form of decentralized economic initiative in which there are many agents able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. A market is a simplified form of cooperation, which is impossible when there is no trust. The European social theorists established that. If there's a simple division between strangers and insiders, the insiders get everything, and the strangers get nothing. There can't be a market economy. So a market is a simplified form of cooperation among strangers that is impossible when there is no trust and unnecessary when there is high trust. Now, in a market, even at the most abstract level, there are at least two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization. That is, the number of economic agents who can bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. And the other dimension of the market at this hyper-abstract level is the absoluteness of the control that each of those agents enjoys over the resources at his command. He can do anything he wants with it at the limit. That would be the extreme form. And a characteristic of this idea that the market is one thing, that it is a thing, and that it has an implicit structure, is that these two dimensions go together naturally.
So
Absolute decentralization with absolute control.
full property rights,
Full property rights,
Then
meaning both
extremely
absolute,
large number of competitors.
an extremely large number of competitors, and each of them having complete control over the area of property.
So that's the idealized free market solution.
Yes, but it's obvious that this is false because these two dimensions don't go together. On the contrary, they contradict each other. And one of the ways in which we could extend the absolute level of economic decentralization is by limiting the degree of control that each of those agents have over the resources, to make the control temporary, or to make it conditional, or fragmentary in some way. And this is actually a profound historical problem in the evolution of the Western societies. And let me give you now an American example. So in the United States, in the period between independence, the foundation of the Republic, and the Civil War, there were two economies in the country. There was the slave economy in the South, but in the North, there was an economy of small-scale proprietors and traders. When Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1830s, only one white man in 5 worked for another white man. So this was the objective petty bourgeoisie. They were, in fact, small-scale proprietors and traders. The Civil War destroyed both of these economies, both the economy of the South and the economy of the North. And rapid concentration began. One of the fundamental reasons why that happened, not just in the United States, but in every Western society, is that the defenders of what was called a property-owning democracy, decentralized many agents, were unable to show how it would be possible to reconcile radical economic decentralization with economies of scale and of scope required by a modern dynamic economy. So decentralization seemed archaic and unrealistic. Now, here's a thought experiment to test the programmatic significance of this idea. It's actually quite far from the things we'll be discussing mainly in the course. Imagine far into the future a society in which the main means of production, the capital of society and the main technologies, are not vested in private owners or in the state, but vested in a series of independent funds that auction off the productive resources of society temporarily to groups of entrepreneurs, technicians, and workers who can use them for whoever can pay the highest rate. And you can imagine that these funds would be established in different models, different time horizons of risk and return, different ways of organizing this process to determine experimentally what would work. Now, would that not be a market? It would be a market, and you could describe it facetiously as capitalism without capitalists. It would be a market, but there would be no capitalists because the productive resources of society would be auctioned to those who could use them most efficiently. Now, here's a curiosity. This thought experiment, which I've just described, is actually the description under orthodox finance theory of what a competitive capital market is supposed to do. It's supposed to auction off the resources to the most productive users. At the time of the privatization scandals in Russia, in post-Soviet Union, they said it doesn't matter who gets the resources of the state first, because there were those kleptocratic entrepreneurs who were buying the productive resources first. So they're going to end up in the hands of the most effective users anyway.
So let me understand the purpose of this thought experiment.
Yes.
So you've sketched a situation where instead of having an economy where you have individuals who already have their own property rights distributed in certain aspects, these property rights are distributed very unequally, creating lots of wealth inequality, which also creates the effect that many profitable economic opportunities cannot get funded because people's ability to invest are determined by their ability to access funds, and that depends on their initial resources. So you've asked us to think of a situation where, in fact, you start with society, all of society's assets being initially owned by the state.
The collective, not by the state.
By a collective, let's call it some form of a sovereign wealth fund.
We don't need the concept of ownership in that system anymore. If we were to need it, we would say society owns it.
Okay. And then, but
society
you're
auctions
going to
off
ask,
to those who temporarily can use it best.
then you're going to ask then groups or individuals to compete temporarily or fragmentary
To be able to use it.
to use those assets.
And of course, they'll be rewarded and so forth, and there will be 1,000 difficulties.
Now, just so that I understand, how are they competing for these resources? I mean, this is being auctioned,
They're auctioned.
and if they don't have their own resources, how do they?
They're presenting the credentials which make it plausible that they could use them best.
So they present plans, they present business plans.
Plans, and they present their personal credentials and so forth. It's not that I'm imagining that we would actually implement this idea.
Okay.
It's that I'm setting up the outcome and contrasting it to this conception of the one market. And this is not the ordinary way in which we would demolish market fundamentalism. We would demolish it from the bottom up, not from the top down.
I think, as you were saying, this is entirely consistent with the way that the most free market economists think about the market, in the sense that,
Except that rather than accepting their premise as automatic, that this is what already happens. It would, as it were, test the proposition.
Yeah, but the point is you're not really, it's not this is something that, the idea of reinventing the market that is embedded in this example doesn't go to the heart of how economists think of a market anyhow.
Of course
because
not. And it would,
let me just sort of finish that thought, which is that one of the features of mainstream economic thought is that you could reduce, the initial distribution of property is arbitrary, and you could redistribute it any particular
Sure.
way that you want, as you were saying in your example of auctioning up Russia's assets, and that you could therefore achieve any distributive outcome that you want, and then achieve benefits of the markets separately. So the idea that that the property rights can be defined in any arbitrary way through any kind of redistribution, is not. Maybe we should practice what economists are saying that could be done rather than reinventing the market, or.
well, in other words, we wouldn't, for example, just take the resources away from their present owners and give them to the workers who work in the present enterprise. Because if we did that, we would then have what, for example, happened in the Yugoslav model.
Okay.
Some firms would prosper, other firms would fail, often for reasons that have nothing to do with the virtues and advantages of those workers. And then the workers in the prospering firms would be able to buy out the failed firms and relegate the workers in those failed firms to second-class category. So,
Okay, so I'm still looking for an example of a reinventing the
Well,
market
I'm
that's going to
saying-
move us in the direction that we
well,
want.
this is not one we could act on.
Okay.
Because it would stop at the initial moment. It presupposes that there's some deus ex machina that can simply take the property away from its owners. So the way in which we in fact have to do it is from the bottom up. And that then goes to our main themes in the course. One of them is the insular knowledge economy. By what means, through what steps, can we create a knowledge economy that gradually, step by step, becomes more inclusive? And when we come to those discussions, I'm going to want to argue that it's not just a matter of disseminating certain educational qualifications that will require institutional innovations, including innovations in access to finance and in the defense of labor.
So you've drawn a distinction between sort of very radical redistribution of assets versus.
The very radical redistribution of assets was just imagined. It's not real.
Okay.
The real is the stepwise thing that we do, what I call from the bottom up. But it is animated by a conception that there's no system there. It's not that the market is one thing. There is a market. No, there isn't. So this is an idea in which we confront right-wing economists on one side, but Marxists also on the other, because the Marxists think there is a system, which they call capitalism.
So, I would say that, so it depends on what you think is the cutting edge of this debate is. If the cutting edge of the debate is the normative idea of a market, whether there's one market, so far I don't think I've heard you say anything that contradicts what most serious economists would accept as, a feature of any market economy or any conceivable way of thinking about a market economy. But I think perhaps if the cutting edge is this path of reforming the economy in this, what you call the bottom-up way, or sort of a gradualistic step-by-step way, and that's
Which can nevertheless be revolutionary.
Which in the end can
Its
become
ultimate
revolutionary.
outcome.
Okay, then I'm going to force you then to provide me, so then we're moving from existing examples. We're working around the edges of existing practices, moving them in a direction step by step gradually in a potentially revolutionary direction. So what would be some of the existing practices which are open to that kind of transformation in a step by step manner?
They all are.
Okay.
I mean, even
So-
if, for example, if you take the existing so-called tiger economies in East Asia, they already differ among themselves in the extent to which they're open to decentralization. So the knowledge economy in Taiwan is more open to decentralization than the knowledge economy in South Korea. And that turns on a series of very specific institutional arrangements, which are backed up by a political support. So that's one area, one large area in which we would create these variations. The second in our plan is labor. I was saying labor has to be free if we're going to democratize production and reinvent the market. And so then there's an agenda of things we have to invent an alternative to this technique of countervailing power of unionization.
Right, so I think we agree that certainly with labor that we need a new model of thinking about the working class that goes, that moves away from the traditional, industrial working class.
And then finance. So by what means can we reestablish finance, working under the principle that the best way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. That is, to enlist finance in the service of production and of the real economy, once again through a series of intermediate steps. So the way of thinking, the dominant way of thinking about change in the world is the one that was imprinted by Marxism on the left in the past 2 centuries. So there's a system, which is the system of the free economy, and the Marxists call capitalism. And you either have that system or you have another system. So that would be socialism, but they don't know how to describe what it is. And that's a false idea, because there is a regime, a system, a structure, but the structure is not changed indivisibly. It's not that you put one indivisible system in the place of another. That's the binary idea of politics. Structural change, when it really happens, is always fragmentary. And the idea of total change is just a limiting case. And so I see the object of most of our discussions in the course as being this world of fragmentary changes in a structural direction. So there's a direction, and one of the main ambitions for the direction is to be inclusive.
And how would you characterize that direction other than just socially inclusive, sustainable?
I think the main feature of the direction is the main ideal underlying the direction is agency, the enhancement of agency, which is, after all, what the subjective petty bourgeoisie in the world wants. What they want is to be their own masters, to have their own little world. But their idea is caught in the archaic model of 19th century family business. So what we have to respond to is that idea. And then on that notion, what is it that, how should we conceive the division between right and left for the purposes of this discussion? We should say there are two elements. One element is the method or the practice, and the progressive or the leftist is the one who refuses to let the structure, the established structure, be the horizon. And he always wants to push his interests, the ideals, beyond the limits of the horizon, and refuses to accept the notion that there's this predefined arrangement which can't be superseded. And the second element in the division between right and left is the ideal. The conservative is the one who thinks that it's natural for human life to be small. And the progressive is the one who thinks that it's not natural for human life to be small. That human life is small except for an elite of heroes, innovators, disruptors, who are exempt from this decree of universal belittlement. And the majority is exempt for it only when there's some great emergency, like war. Then everyone is lifted up. So Pierre can look at the sky and see Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet is Russia's invasion by Napoleon. And he sees that everyone's life will be broken apart and they'll be emancipated from the long littleness of life. And the progressive is the one who thinks it's not natural for human life to be small, that we can all rise, provided that we rise together to a higher form of life with more capability, with more intensity, with more scope. That's the division between right and left, which underlies these structural debates.
Yeah, I'm going to try to bring you down to the ground again.
But you were the one who provoked rising up.
Well, I might have done that unwittingly. But so let's talk for a second very concretely, for example, about what I mentioned in my remarks at the beginning as probably the most significant departure from neoliberalism in recent years was the Biden agenda, where Biden very explicitly took on the challenge of sort of being pro-worker, restoring the middle class, embarking in a very major way on green transition and subsidizing renewables and green tech, and significant investment in manufacturing domestically and supply chain resilience and so forth, with partly national security goals, but by partly building back some of the communities that had been.
And each of those legal initiatives of his had this ambiguity that from another angle they represented subsidies to capital.
That's what I was going to. So one perspective on this was that it was essentially, playing, capitalist game, transferring significant amount of resources to businesses and capital. Another perspective would be that this was transformational in the sense that, just because beyond subsidies, these were also already institutionally establishing new forms of collaborative arrangements with local stakeholder businesses, and that went beyond, for example, in investments in workforce training, in engagements with local development agencies.
Ambiguity in them. But this ambiguity is what is necessary in the world anyway. That's not a reason to criticize it.
Oh, okay. I thought you were criticizing.
No, I'm not criticizing.
So how do you think about that Biden agenda, where it went in the right direction, where it didn't go far enough?
Of course, I'd like to see it less subsidy to capital,
less subsidy,
and more foreshadowing of an alternative arrangement. If you imagine this as a spectrum, it was very heavily loaded to the first side of the spectrum rather than to the second.
Okay. Okay.
And it didn't represent even the beginnings of the organization of an alternative coalition of productivist interests.
Why not?
Where?
Why not?
Because it didn't design it. It wasn't an American example of that alliance of the productivist counter-elite with a subjective petty bourgeoisie. So the underlying situation, going back to the beginning of your talk,
yes,
of the political reality, is the majority of the population experiences itself as dispossessed and abandoned. After all, the leaders of the putatively progressive party in the United States, the the Democratic Party, seemed to have had as their ambition to make the United States more like the Sweden of 1970 through compensatory entitlements and redistribution and so forth. They had no real productivist program. And if we now generalize this example to the world, in the whole world, and especially in the rich countries, the poor, most of whom are in this subjective petty bourgeoisie, feel abandoned by the supposed progressive parties and rebelled against the center-right and the center-left parties, and then became susceptible to manipulation by this authoritarian plutocratic populism.
I agree with a lot of what you're saying. So I think the strong part of the Biden agenda was that it did promote the green transition in a major way that had been impossible to date in the United States, because to date in the United States it had taken the form of trying to encourage decarbonization, and that's largely sort of making things more expensive and harder, and ran into political roadblocks, whereas the strategy for the green transition in the IRA is a very badly misnamed Inflation Reduction Act, was to actually cheapen the use of renewables and therefore subsidizing. So instead, in other words, instead of using the stick for decarbonization, using the carrot of subsidies, and that's why it was overwhelmingly geared towards subsidizing businesses. And I think as a political strategy, that I think was probably the right thing to do, although it does entail, maybe $1 trillion of subsidies that a lot of them went to corporations. But I wonder if politically that was the only viable way of engineering these new investments in renewables, which, by the way, was the path that China had undertaken in the last 10 years, and that's how the cost of renewables have fallen. Where I see, so I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the subsidies than perhaps you were. Where I think we might be closer together is on sort of the attempt to resuscitate the 19th century Sweden model, if you will, that was with a heavily sort of manufacturing
It was 20th century.
Industries, the 20th century. But I mean, it was basically a focus on manufacturing as the major vehicle through which you target the
Conventional industry.
Conventional. I think, of course, a lot of that was driven by the national security and competition against China kind of fears. But there was, on that there was tacked on that this is how we're going to build back our communities that were being badly hurt by the industrialization imports. Whereas most of these investments in manufacturing and semiconductors and so forth aren't really generating tremendous amount of good jobs, and they're not going, they're generating good jobs, but the numbers are very
not in their
small.
current form.
And so this focus on manufacturing, therefore, in some sense, was missing the target in terms of bringing the lower middle classes or the middle classes, or creating a path to middle class for a very large number of Americans. But I think there was a productivist element in this approach. If you go beyond the subsidies, there was a lot of trying to build up local collaborations and partnerships of local stakeholders in different communities, working with the federal government to try to diagnose, for example, what are some of the local challenges, what are binding constraints, what needs to be invested in, where do we need to generate a new vision for local economic development and so forth. So I think there was a kernel of productivism, or what in a different setting has been called developmentalism, which is trying to think in terms of a developmental vision and bring different actors around that vision to generate both local visions and ability to act collectively to generate new investment opportunities, provide the requisite public inputs and so forth. But maybe 4 years may have been too little to that. So I do see a kernel of the kinds of collective action that we might be basing our hopes for kind of reinventing the market and a new kind of political economy on a grander scale in some of these local experiments. That has always been, a kind of under the radar screen in the United States, but maybe we're a little bit ignited a little bit more through these federal efforts under Biden.
Well, the criticism you can make of the whole arrangement in the world, not the United States, like the United Nations, under the umbrella of the United Nations, the climate meetings, is that they're focused on the negative, on the constraints, paying for the externalities,
Yes.
rather than converging on the creation of the alternative energy model.
So I think that's very right. So I think the way to the green transition for the rest of the world as well will be to transform it into a growth opportunity, to think about it as a way that this is how you can move forward.
For
by
example,
investing
just
in green
not that this is what the solution is, but in the long term, some expression of solar energy, but in the short term, in the intermediate, something else, which is related to that, like hydrogen. But
So,
they have to
yeah.
converge on the road and not just converge on the punitive framework.
So I mean, there are some parts of the world where the opportunities are actually quite significant. I mean, often, for example, sub-Saharan Africa is mentioned as an area.
Well, if I could put it in another setting, I think of my own country, in Brazil,
Yes.
we have the Amazon. And there's this discussion of sustainable development of the Amazon, and the discussion has no content. Because what is the sustainable development of the Amazon? Either it is a primitive extractivism, like the native populations pick up rubber from the floor of the forest, or they draw latex from the trees. Either it's that, an archaic, primitive extractivism, without scale, without technology, and therefore without a future, or it is a variant of the knowledge economy. There's nothing in between. And that's a situation which is characteristic of much of the world.
So let's take another break here and open it up for comments or discussion or question. I have more to ask you, and you may ask me too if you want, but we can continue. But let me see if there are any. Yes.
Hi. So I just had a question about pretty much when you guys were talking about competition. And so I was thinking specifically, we talked, I guess in the readings, it was mentioning about self-interest and a lot about what really makes the unequal system that we live in. But then I was thinking in the terms of competition, sometimes that leads to, for example, a hierarchy where some people are left out. So I guess my question is more so, how do you put safe controls on competition while allowing for individuals to be active participants and actors in the market is kind of where my thinking is going.
So how do you reconcile self-interest and competition with what Roberto mentioned as being able to build agency and autonomy of individuals at the same time?
Yeah.
Where do you see that? Where do you see the tension concretely?
I think specifically in competition, obviously there's always the people that are going to have an advantage, right? But sometimes that advantage can kind of clash with self-interest. And so the readings were mentoring about caring, I guess, or just being more invested in what's making things right for people. And sometimes I think competition kind of gets lost and it's focused more on what can be produced rather than who are the people behind it. So I guess it's kind of that clash for me that it makes it unclear how can you put a safe measure on that, but also allow people to actually be participants in the market and making things fair is kind of the clash.
I mean, it seems to me that economists, the traditional economist way of thinking about competition and self-interest has been sort of superseded by much more realistic understanding of human nature. So the old, textbook notion of individuals as being self-interested, and that sort of then competition among self-interested individuals producing what's ultimately best for society is not a very good way of thinking about how markets work, for at least for a couple of reasons. One is, as I think you're getting at, is that sort of self-interest is only part of human nature. That I think another part of human nature is sociality. That people are other regarding. I don't think anybody is entirely self-interested in that kind of a way.
Furthermore, I think in the old form of industrialization and the forms of the market economy that we've inherited, competition and cooperation are allocated to separate domains. But one of the characteristics of the knowledge economy is what we call cooperative competition. That is the combination of competition and cooperation in the same domains, within firms, among firms, and so forth. And that produces a better, a more complicated system in which we don't think of competition as being simply the antithesis of cooperation.
Other comments or questions?
You mentioned that using financing for real economy, but in reality, right, the majority of financing are related to real economy, like venture capital, private equity. The end target is always real economy. So in today's world, because you mentioned that you think a lot of financiers are parasites. And could you elaborate on that? What exactly do you mean by are the parasites you're talking about?
I'm glad somebody's giving you pushback on calling finance parasites.
I would never call parasites those who hire half of the talent that graduates from Harvard College.
No, but I think that's a useful question. What about venture capital? That is.
Well, I said that's so. What would be most useful would be the funding of the production of new assets in new ways, but that's tiny.
I think Roberto's point is that when you look at the total size of finance, the bulk of finance is really trading of one asset. It's really trading one asset for another. That's not really linked to the generation of a new asset. Venture capital is the primary counterexample where it's actually funding startups and innovators. But
of course,
quantitatively, it's a tiny share of the aggregate financial system, even in the United States, where venture capital is the largest.
So
by the way, yeah.
So you have to bring it down to the details. For example, take options. So options in agricultural markets provide a real service of liquidity. But the use of options in equity markets began as an antidote to gambling and over time was converted into a device of gambling. Then it's parasitic. Now, it's not that the speculative element of finance has no justification. It develops information, it organizes the allocation of risk. The problem is when the speculative element in finance becomes dissociated from any commitment to production. So this discussion would have to become much more detailed. But I would then defend this distinction between the productive and the parasitic, even in the detail.
And again, there too, I don't think you're going to have significant pushback from economists that there is a significant category of finance that's not particularly productive. I think the pushback would come at the operational level, which is to say, how do you operationalize any system of regulating finance that can, on a day-to-day basis, appropriately make that distinction? You don't have to answer that, but I think that's the operationally
one of the topics of our
operationally the
discussion,
question.
of course.
Yes. Yeah, Joshua.
Professor Unger, I was wondering if you could speak a little more about why this aspiration for small businesses and to have your own family business is somehow insufficient.
Somehow,
Insufficient.
well, it's an archaic, it's not an engine of economic revolution in society. So if what the person does is open a restaurant or a laundromat or something, we know that the world of family business is a world which is not ordinarily related to this ladder up of revolution in productivity. And it is based on family saving and self-exploitation. So it doesn't lead out of the wilderness. That is, what the person hopes who's in that world is that at least he'll be lifted out of poverty and he'll have his little domain in which he will be the master.
I think we have, I think I disagree a little bit there. And I think inherently, your presumption that small businesses cannot be the foundation for economic growth and strong.
No, I didn't intend to say that. I didn't intend to say that. Because after all, a startup in the knowledge economy can be a small business.
So you do a small family-owned business.
I think there's a particular world, it has a particular social distinction, isolated, archaic family business.
Well, I'm saying isolated archaic is, you're presuming that, and of course,
Well, because that's
who
the
wants
reality.
isolated and archaic? Nobody wants. But I think the question was whether.
No, they do want it.
Why are you so negative on small family-owned businesses? Was the question. Is that?
Because for the individual, they promise a lift out of the world of poverty, but they don't lead to riches and power and to the future and outside. If they were more like,
I think I want to underline what you're assuming that would be true. You're assuming scale economies. You're assuming that
it's not just scale economies. I think that's a
No,
simplification.
with AI and digital tools. You
Well,
can
because that's a
essentially
startup. Yes.
No, not producing. I'm saying providing small businesses with AI and digital tools and ways of improving their productivity.
Bring them closer to the culture of startups, yes.
They can be much more productive and they
But
can
the
be very
secret is
fulfilling.
not just the technology. The secret is the whole set of ideas and attitudes.
So I presume that small property owners are.
I don't.
Anyhow, well, so that's.
I think that's really not a. What I was trying to do at that moment is to invoke the power of this attraction in the world. For the vast majority of people who are in this subjective petty bourgeoisie, what they aspire to is not the first step in a ladder of rising productivity. It may be
So
turn out to be
you have all
that.
this Marxist baggage in sort of when you're thinking of these, small property owners, like they cannot be a progressive force. Why? Well, because Marxists don't think.
I don't believe that, because actually
I
in
don't think there's anything wrong with a society that's based on small family-owned businesses if they have the productive means to be productive and have high levels of earnings. And that is possible in a world where you don't have strong scale economies or where technology can be disseminated.
I think
and you have things like distributed
I think the
manufacturing,
test-
like that, where
the test
you can
for-
deploy this stuff at small scale.
the
So-
test for that was the American story I told. So
No, but that was the era of scale economies. That's why you needed to put all these workers into factories to produce on a mass.
So you could say, if you use the practices and technologies of the knowledge economy and brought them to the small-scale proprietors of the property-owning democracy,
Potentially.
they could become the vanguard, yes.
Potentially, yes.
But that would have to be combined with a series of other changes, psychological, cultural, and so forth.
But I do
My
think
main
that
intention
it's
there was
not a
not-
debating argument, because I think that when you look at about the future of these economies, because the vast majority of people are not going to be employed in these factories, so it's not inconceivable to think of a vision of society where people take pride in what they do. They're small-scale property owners, but they're progressive technologically and in other ways as
Yes.
well. And that would be one implication of disseminating the knowledge economy.
So, and that can be so even in agriculture, that is.
Oh, it is.
They
In
can
fact,
be
it is.
small-scale farmers,
It is.
but still do precision or scientific
Absolutely.
agriculture.
In fact, that's a good example. I think the reason that agriculture doesn't get us the whole way there is because agriculture is not a labor-absorbing sector. The more they will use technology and precision agriculture and things like that, the fewer people there will be in agriculture, because they're fundamentally just feeding people, and people, the budget share of food products tend to go down. But that whole third sector of services and craft services, and other
Undoubtedly.
things, that's
a
kind of
large
it's
frontier
a
of
large
innovation.
frontier, and one implication of sort of a potentially future vision of society where people have autonomy, agency, is the people they're free labor because they're working for themselves.
So if you, now going back to the politics with which you began, in these contemporary, especially societies, in the contemporary rich economies, it's precisely the relatively unequipped and uncredentialed part of the working class, which is then the object or the victim of this seduction by the populist demagogues.
Exactly.
Because the credential part, the part that is more equipped, goes in fact to provide services in the relatively more advanced economy.
Yeah.
Kind of going off of the same, going off of that same debate between the two of you, is it possible that these small family-owned businesses might help with the restoration of the middle class question, but not with the large-scale economic growth, and that we're kind of melding those two questions?
So my answer to that would be yes, I think it would help with the middle class. The question of whether it helps with growth is if we are able to power them also productively with the technology, because they then lift themselves up, and then as they lift the entire economy up too. So I think that also helps with the growth question. Where it doesn't explicitly help with was the green transition, because we're talking about largely about services. And then so we would need a kind of a front on which we're pushing for renewables and green tech that often will require investments in new technologies that won't be necessarily well handled by this small family businesses.
Let me register an objection, a Marxist objection, to the category of the middle class. What is middle class? Most people in the United States don't have $500 on which they can draw in an emergency. That's the reality. I think the meaning of middle class, the American idiom of middle class, is a middle class person is a worker with a bourgeois identity. So it's a suspect category. There's the asset holding class. And so what's the class structure of the United States? It's a variant of the universal class structure of the advanced societies. There's an ultra-rich plutocratic class. There's the professional executive class. There's a small business class. And then there's the working class, which has a white collar and a blue collar segment. The two main episodes of social mobility in American history were the children of farmers and farmhands became industrial workers, and the children of industrial workers became office workers. And then underneath, there's a racially stigmatized underclass. So I've now accounted for the whole class structure of the United States without alluding to the conception of a middle class.
I think there are at least two other senses of the middle class that you can use that I think to me are more meaningful. One is actually you can ask people directly whether they feel they're part of the middle class, or you can ask, do you think your children will be part of the middle class? So that would be attitudinally, are they middle class or not? The second way is actually by measuring the actual distribution of income in society, and you can actually, for every household, say, where do you stand in relation to the median income? If you're in a sort of group which is like X% larger than the median and then no smaller than X% below the median, that would be the middle class. And if you measure it by that way also, whether you measure it attitudinally or by the actual distribution of income, it's clear that by both measures, the size of the middle class in the United States has shrunk.
Because historically, the United States conceives of itself as a classless society. When Herbert Hoover accepted the nomination to run again for president after the Depression, the speech he gave at Madison Square Garden said, we're not like those European societies that have classes. In our country, the individual rises and falls like an atom in a free-floating medium. So this is a complete illusion.
Questions? Yep.
Professor, you talked about how small family-owned businesses frees up labor. But I think through my upbringing in Egypt, I grew up in Egypt, I've seen that while there are a lot of small family-owned businesses and it does free up labor, the problem actually comes from this labor oversupply. So if you go into a cafe in Egypt or a coffee place in Egypt, you have 10 people standing behind a desk and they're trying to help you. And so the oversupply comes in, there's a diminishing marginal returns, lower productivity, and from that comes lower pay, lower productivity. And I think I've seen, and people in Egypt have seen, that the middle class has disappeared. My question is, how can you reconciliate all of that, and how can you put, small family-owned businesses with the growth class together?
So I think the problem in that you're describing, which is, I think it's you described very evocatively, is one that exists in a lot of low and middle income countries where, because of lack of productive employment opportunities, what has happened is that workers have flocked into informal service sectors and petty economic activities in the informal areas. And so you will see these service activities with lots of people and what you call sort of oversupply of workers. Everybody's doing something, but nobody's particularly productive. And I think this reflects partly what we've been discussing, and we'll discuss much more in our next session next week, is the disappearance of industrialization as a path of absorbing workers. So that the typical East Asian growth model is that as people came out from traditional agriculture, rather than being employed in these small-scale businesses, micro-enterprises in the informal sector, they were drawn into wage employment in factories. And that became a path for creating middle-class societies. That is not happening. So in countries like Egypt, you have all these workers flooding into unproductive, informal activities. So how do you get out of that? This is obviously not a sustainable situation. I think the key in our discussion was precisely making some of these traditionally low productivity activities much more productive. So imagine that rather than having these millions of coffee shops, right, you have sort of more specialized niche production of sort of food services to different kinds of groups, basically being able to serve consumer demands in a much better way. That creates incomes which in turn allow some of the people that would have been just sort of the extra labor then to go and do their own, provide their own services in an equally productive way. So the link there is how do you increase the productivity of these people? If they become more productive, they're able to serve the needs better. In doing so, they also actually enable other people to provide other kinds of services. And this could be a kind of self-reinforcing process where higher productivity generates demand, which in turn generates demand for other services, generates jobs. But the way that you can get there is by having higher productivity. And where is that productivity going to come from? I think it's very much linked to this sort of how do you disseminate the knowledge economy and digital approaches, AI and so forth. Because a lot of these services can benefit from these tools in providing much higher productivity services. We'll hopefully discuss that potentially even on Monday. So we have to stop here. We reached 3 o'clock. So on next week, we're going to be focusing much more directly on the past, present, and future of inclusive economic growth. So what has worked in the past, why it's changing, and how to think of new growth strategies for the future. And we'll be joined by Daron and Jamal, as I said in that discussion. See you next week.
I enjoyed it. Not kept in spontaneity. Yeah. Sempre tem a opção do bar, né? Sim. Sentar lá. Mas o problema lá fica feio.
Que horas que ele queria chegar assim,
não, eu acho que abre às 5h10. Então tem um pessoal que às 5h10 já está em fila. Né?